Hi, Joshua.
Hello.
And hi to all of you. This is our 20th anniversary Elantris retrospective. Joshua is my agent, for those who don't know. We thought we would sit for a little while here and just chat about Elantris. 20 years.
Yep.
We're old.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, I know. It feels like I just did the 10th anniversary of Elantris, where I was talking about, hey, let's do a 10th anniversary edition and the Leatherbound and things like that. But that was like 2014 or 2013 when we started talking about that. And 20 years. Let's talk about where Elantris came from, because you've got a perspective on this. Do you remember when I contacted you about Elantris?
You contacted me about this book for the first time after Moshe Feder had successfully tracked you down.
Yep.
Because he had had the manuscript for long enough for you to have moved from your BYU address, but he had tracked you down assiduously and said that he wanted to get Tor to buy the book.
Yeah. I got a phone call one day. I got up, it was actually a voicemail, and it said, hey, this is Moshe Feder. I don't know if you remember, you sent me a book. It was 18 months ago at that point. He still, every time I talk to Moshe, he's like, oh, it wasn't 18 months. It was 18 months. He pretends, oh, it must have been 2 or 3 months. Yeah. It was a year and a half. I had sent it to him after meeting him at World Fantasy Convention. And he had gotten my voicemail, and he'd had to track it down, like you said, because I had an AOL email address. This is how old this is. If you young kids don't know, your email address at AOL was tied to your account. If you stopped paying the $20 a month for AOL as your ISP, you lost your email address. This was actually really common. If you got if your email was through Comcast because you were getting Comcast internet, if you stopped your net, they just cut you off and you couldn't access that anymore. No forwarding, no nothing. Your email's gone. It's like you're just out of luck. And so I had done that, and this was also the time where we were all transitioning from landlines to cell phones. And I'd put my landline on there, but by the time that he was calling, no one had landlines already. It was that fast. And at a year's time, landlines were dying, and we all had cell phones. And so his was like the last batch I'd sent out with a landline phone number. After that, I had my cell phone, which is the same number I have now. So if he'd been just a little later, he would have had that number that I would end up keeping for 30 more years or 20 more years so far.
Yeah.
I'd moved because I had graduated and gotten into grad school, and so there was no way to get a hold of me. It was that AOL email address. When I found out I couldn't use that anymore, I thought, oh no. And I actually sent to several places I'd sent books and said, hey, here's my new updated info. But he'd had this forever, and I thought it was just dead and lost. So he calls me, and even then, I call him back. I get him on the phone. Even that first phone call, he's like, just so you know, I'm bipolar. That was like one of the first things he ever told me. And so that's also been kind of laced into the history of my writing is, when can we get Moshe to do edits? When is he manic? When is he not? But he calls me, and so I put down that phone, and I think did I email you or did I call you?
I think it was a phone call.
I think it was
I think it was a phone call.
Here's what it was. I had sent you a manuscript that you had rejected, but you rejected it very nicely with a bunch of revision notes. And then I sent you another manuscript. And you called me and said, okay, no one tells new authors the rules. If an agent or editor they don't go through 3 pages of revision notes without saying they want to see the story again. But they can't promise they want to see the story again because they don't want you to get your hopes up. But if they send you 3 pages of revision notes, don't send them the next book. Revise the book and then send it to them again and see if they're willing to see it again. So you had called me and told me this, which is why I had your phone number.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember calling me? And it's Joshua, so it felt like getting chewed out because you never talk to Joshua without feeling like you're getting chewed out in some way.
No, because I think you were becoming better as a writer. If I
Yes.
remember the chronology correctly, Elantris was what, book 6
Book
of
6.
13?
Yes. And you never saw Elantris.
Right.
I sent you White Sand, and you just kind of rejected it with a polite, normal rejection. There was nothing. And then I sent you another book. I'm trying to remember what it was. And you wrote back
It was
and said,
the one with the black sea creatures,
yes,
I think.
Aether of Night.
yeah.
And you wrote back on that one. I think on that one you said, this isn't there. Send me your next book.
Yeah.
And then I sent you something. It was either like Mistborn Prime or Final Empire Prime. And you sent back this big, long thing. And that's the one where I sent you a polite, thank you, I'll send you the next book. And you're like, no. Now you're at the point where you should try selling me on something that you're revising.
So, but I had never seen Elantris.
Nope.
And even though you had Moshe saying he was ready to buy it for Tor, I wasn't going to just say yes.
Nope.
I was like, well, let me read the book.
Yep.
And I agreed to say yes to representing it because even though it still had problems, I had a pretty clear roadmap on how I thought they could be fixed.
You did kind of laugh at me when I said, hey, because I don't know how much you remember. I got you on the phone and I said, I did something that might be a problem. And you're like, oh, what is this? And I'm like, I think I just sold a book to Tor. And you're like, that's not a problem. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, it's a book you haven't seen. And you're like, well, send me the book. If I like it, I'll pick it up. Free money. I think you even said free money in that conversation or something. But you weren't willing to do it till you read the book. You were the major force. The big problem that Elantris had was, and I tell this story all the time, is I'd introduced a new villain at the 3/4 mark that had come and thrown everything into chaos, and we basically had 50,000 words of just dealing with this thing, and then status quo. We just return to the status quo. It was a big old Canto Bight deviation, like in that Star Wars movie where they go off, accomplish nothing, come back, and it's like the status quo again. And you said, well, you just need to cut that whole sequence. And I'm like, no, I love that sequence. You're like, give it a try, see how it works. And so I think this is the book that editorially someone other than me had the biggest influence over because I cut that 30 to 40,000, it wasn't a full 50.
Yeah.
And I cut that out, and it made the book so much better. And so it's by the time I was writing Mistborn, this is book number 6, Mistborn is book number 14. I was better with structure by that point. Everyone needs to be edited, but this is the one where you can point and say, Joshua kind of fixed this book.
Yeah. And it's interesting when I think about it, I ask myself, would the book have been the same if Moshe had just bought it?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure because Moshe was really good on the line editing. We kind of got that pretty clearly over the years. I was generally stronger on the structure stuff, which, as you say, there was less of it as the books went along, but it didn't instantly zero out.
No.
But the books benefited from having two editorial perspectives focused on two very different things. And the other part of that was I knew Moshe well enough, knew Tor well enough kind of to know, and especially with Moshe, that things probably were not going to happen quickly. So you didn't have the opportunity then to just kind of say, well, this is what the editor wants to do.
Right. You could get in there first.
Because it took 6 more months from that first call before Moshe finally had navigated all of the internal processes and called to say, and now I have the offer.
Right, and I had already done the revision that you'd recommended by then.
Yeah.
I think you also recommended the 10% cut. I can't remember who recommended it.
Pretty sure.
And that's where it was 250 when I sent it out. And I think that Mad Pritch sequence was really more like 30. And then I cut 20,000 just with a 10% cut. And that's the core of the revisions. I will say Moshe it can be good. He's a very good editor with theme, and like he can come and say, Brandon, you're twisting too much, too many twists. And I think he said that about this. And he could say, like on Warbreaker, he's like, Brandon, the humor needs to go up a notch and things like that. They're good substantive things. You've always been better with this specific sequence is too long. This specific sequence should be cut and that sort of thing. And so it really was you and Moshe. You probably should get an edited by credit on this book in particular, because this is the book you did the most. You had the biggest influence over, I would say.
I would say that the comparable was several years later suggesting, why don't you try Alcatraz in first person? That's probably the other really
that was only like 1 year later, but that was you were absolutely right on that one as well. Yep.
So I think those are the two things editorially.
Yep. Where you should probably get an edited by credit.
Yeah.
I didn't, on some of those Alcatraz books, I didn't even have an editor. It was kind of just you. Because Scholastic, we had lost our editor, and the new editor didn't care. And so I was just, Joshua's editing those books, is basically what happened.
And then it ended up essentially being a tie, that the call came in March, and then it was September when you turned in the new draft almost simultaneous
You remember
with
that?
Moshe. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Because then the next question was, because it was a tie, I had never had an opportunity really before the offer came in to discuss, should we send it to other publishers? So that discussion was happening just at the same time, and you kind of decided, well, I don't know, maybe something else would happen also, but really Moshe is the editor who wanted to buy my first book, and I'm going to sell him my first book.
And I know you've all, I remember that conversation distinctly, because you didn't push too hard. You like, okay, I understand. But you always felt like you could have taken this book, particularly with Mistborn, at that point, like in rough draft stage, and you could have gotten me a very big contract. And when maybe I don't know. Every time I gave you something, you went and got a very big contract. So,
but the context, broader marketplace picture was Elantris was selling at a period in time when this kind of fantasy was in a downswing.
Yep.
Because after Terry Goodkind, there had been this real upswing in people trying to have the new Terry Goodkind.
Late 90s.
Most of those books didn't work.
A lot of them flopped big. Yeah.
So at the time we had Elantris to sell, people were kind of now backtracking because they had just had so many. So I don't know if I would. And when I asked you, do we take it elsewhere, I kind of knew you were going to say no.
Right.
But part of the job as an agent is sometimes to present people with an option that you know that they're not going to say yes to.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the little book that could in a lot of ways, because what happened, what people didn't know at the time is, so you have these big Goodkind-esque flops. You can look up The Fifth Sorceress as one of the most famous ones. And in the meantime, what had taken off in the industry had been Harry Potter and Twilight. In straight-up adult science fiction fantasy, Game of Thrones was looming. When did the first season come out? Because Game of Thrones, the first book, A Game of Thrones, was like 95. And it actually launched pretty big in the community. George was well respected in the community at the time. I know that I got back from Korea, so maybe it was 96. I got back from Korea, and it was the book everyone was talking about.
And you were correct. It was August 96 when first...
96, yeah. And when did the first season come out?
2011.
So everybody was talking about that, and it was the big thing. And really, early 2000s is when it had cemented its sales dominance, and everybody wanted more of that. I remember being at a convention trying to pitch one of my books to, do you remember Steve Saffel?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Steve Saffel at Del Rey. And he said, He's like, no, go read the opening to a Game of Thrones and write that, is what he told me. And this was just like a year before I was trying to sell Elantris. And that's where I tried to write some grimdark, and it wasn't very good. Everybody, I joke, was hunting for Joe Abercrombie. But grimdark had already, by 2005, when I sold this in 2003, it came out in 2005, had started, like, really, George launched in 1996. It was ready to kind of respond back against. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Elantris and Name of the Wind and N.K. Jemisin, 100,000 Kingdoms, which is more on the kind of epic fantasy side than her next series, which was much more literary, and Brent Weeks, all launched at the same time because people were ready to come back to high magic, high fantasy again after the grimdark, low fantasy thing. So in a lot of ways, we were very lucky to be like the first one back in that rebound.
And now we're in an interesting place where a lot of that marketplace has kind of moved to KU and things, because the big publishers just seem to have like lost their knack for knowing how to sell a book like Elantris.
They don't seem to know how to launch a author that's going to be a slow mid-list rise to bestseller. It's either bestseller from the get-go, whatever the trend is, or you're gone.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems with the industry right now. Not the indie authors. They're great. It's just that publishing doesn't know how to establish an author. They don't know how to stick with an author long enough for them to become Brandon Sanderson. Because Elantris came out, and it did not break any sales records.
No, but it sold very steadily. It got good reviews. It definitely marked you as an author who people should keep an eye on.
I remember, though, when we got our first week, and I think our first week was 600 copies.
Yeah.
And you got the book scan, and you called me. And back then, 600 was 600. There were no ebook and audiobook, essentially. There was, like a handful of copies to libraries for audiobook, and ebooks just didn't exist. And so you called me, and you're like, well, we got our first week numbers. It was 600 copies, and I was devastated. Because 600 copies, we go through all of this, and we sold 600 copies. And you were like, no, that's actually pretty decent. You're fine. Yeah. And really what sold Elantris was not those 600 copies. It was the 400 copies the next week, and then 400 again.
Yeah.
And then 400 again. And I remember 6 months later, us sitting and chatting and looking at the book scan numbers and being like, wow.
It wasn't even BookScan back then. I don't think I had BookScan in 2005.
I think you did. I think it was
because
I had a spreadsheet.
It was another couple years. Maybe you're right, but in my mind, I got BookScan more like 2000. But
you might be right. I remember when you said I finally got a BookScan subscription.
Okay.
So maybe you got these from Tor.
Yeah, I might have been getting the numbers from Tor. Mm-hmm. Back then, it was Joshua Scan.
You did have Joshua Scan, but these were actually hard numbers.
Yeah,
because I had my spreadsheet going.
Yeah.
We'll talk about Joshua Scan. We will definitely talk about that. But one thing I should talk about is where we got the symbols and the artwork. Do you remember having anything to do with that?
No, I do not.
So I went to Tor and I said, I'd like to have a map. How do I get a map done? And they're like, I don't know. Moshe said, I don't know. Let me talk. And he came back and he's like, we don't know. And I'm like, you're the biggest publisher of science fiction and fantasy in the world. How do other authors get their maps? And he was just like, they just kind of happen. Someone internally maybe does some of them, and some. Yeah. And like, we could work on them. Like, why don't I have one of my friends do the map? I know an artist. If he does the map, will you guys pay him? Is that what happened? He's like, yeah, that'll work. And so I went and I got Jeff Creer to do the original map. The ones in this Leatherbound are redone by Isaac by this point.
Yeah.
But Jeff did the map for me, did a really good job for his first map ever. And then he never got paid because it's Tor. And he sent them an invoice and he never got paid. And he sent them, and finally, and this is another just kind of fortuitous thing, I said, I've got my advance, I'll pay you. And it was like $500 out of my initial advance payment of $5,000 minus the Joshua cut, so it was like $4,000. So I'm paying, a significant portion of my money to the artist, but I paid for it. But then we owned the copyright. He sold me the copyright on it, which meant that we could stick it in everything, and we didn't have to worry. Like, we're doing the Wheel of Time Leatherbounds right now. Nobody knows who owns the rights to any of the symbols in the Wheel of Time. Tor has no idea, and Harriet has no idea.
Pro tip, own your map.
Own your map.
It's like I have told that to so many people over the last 20 years. Own your map. Like, you don't let the publisher commission and do the paperwork for your map.
Now, we know who did the maps, and they're great, the maps for Wheel of Time, but there's no, as I understand, contract. It's just somebody who did the maps, and they put them in. And so for the Wheel of Time, we went and redid them. We were planning to anyway. Yeah. But we didn't know, even like on the symbols, who to credit for designing the symbols and stuff like that. Like, the publishers tend to be very good with everything from the cover outward and getting the contracts for the cover art and stuff. Anything inside, you should do. And I drew the symbols myself. Yeah. I drew them in MS Paint. And they came in and they're like, these are pretty good. And they're like, we'll have somebody touch them up. And someone took them and essentially they just run them through a filter, which actually really improved them. I was quite pleased. So if you look on the cover, you'll see that the lines taper off at the ends and are thicker during the middle. They look more like brush strokes and things. That was what the filter did. Or maybe they did them, hand did them, but they were obviously traced over mine and things like that. But we didn't know like who owned those. So when we did our own version, we just did them all over again. Owning your own symbols, owning your own maps, good idea. But this to this day is the only book of mine that my artwork is in. Because even though someone else touched them up, the symbols are my symbols that I drew.
So, no, I did not remember that. I do remember another 20th anniversary for 2025. It's also the year I first met Isaac.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he came to the World Fantasy in Madison.
Okay.
And that was one of my best conventions ever because it's the place where I first met Isaac before he was really like, maybe he was just starting kind of, but not when he was like Isaac, Brandon's, he was a writer looking to kind of, break in and network. And I met Bryce Moore, who we still represent all these years later.
Bryce's son came to my Magic draft a couple weeks ago. So he's out here at school.
And Tim Akers, who I still work with. And speaking of Steve Saffel, Steve actually bought books from Tim when he was at Titan.
Well, there we are.
Yeah. So, but
you and your memory.
But that was a very good convention to have met three people that I still get to work with 20 years.
Do you remember meeting me at...
the Nebulas, absolutely.
You really do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Talking to Ethan, or Scar.
Talking to Scar.
Who
came running down to me and said, I met Simon Green's agent.
Yes, and then Brandon. So that's why we could all know it was 18 months, because it's the same place where you met Moshe, and you sent us both books shortly.
It's actually
after that.
I met him. It was actually World Fantasy. I met you at the Nebula weekend. It was a year later. But I sent you something immediately. You had a year head start.
Okay.
And during that year, you got through 4 of my books, I think. The 4, I sent to him a year later. I remember that World Fantasy in Madison. Madison's a good town. I enjoyed it there. I enjoyed going to a convention, having already sold things and not having to stress about selling things. Those early days of going and meeting you at the Nebula weekend was stressful because I'm like, I've spent this money to get out to New York. I don't have a lot of money. How do I take one evening and actually make contacts? I was super stressed about it, and I met you, who became my agent, and I also I met what's his name at Tor, who left a little while ago. I sent him a book, and he never got back to me.
Patrick?
No, it wasn't Patrick. It was Jim.
Mins?
Jim Mins.
Jim Mins, yeah.
Super nice.
Yeah.
but he never got to the book, and then he eventually left. So
Yeah.
So we did that. I got that phone call from Moshe in like May, and I called you, and you had read the book and agreed to take me on as a client very soon after. It didn't take you 18 months. And then we got the contracts in November because that was also a world fantasy.
Yeah.
Which one was that?
That was Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C., okay.
Pretty sure, yeah.
And so we flew out, and you took me to Korean food.
Yeah. And
To
then
celebrate.
the thing at the, that was then we went to the FedEx
We went to the
Kinko's,
FedEx.
which we all still talk about.
I'll tell you the story. We go in, we sign the contract, and you're like, you need a copy for your records. Make sure you always do this, right? This is Joshua taking care of new writers. And so we're like, all right. Well, you go in, and I made a copy, and I walked out, and you stayed outside. I don't know why you were window browsing or something. You're like, did you get a receipt? I'm like, no, it was 17 cents. It's 4 pages. You're like, go back in and get a receipt. You need to start tracking these things for your 17 cents or whatever it was at Kinko's. And I did it. I went in and got a receipt, but I didn't ever claim it for anything.
And I think that FedEx Kinko's is still there on like 14th Street Northwest in D.C. near McPherson Squares. If you're ever in the neighborhood, look at it. That's a famous Brandon Sanderson landmark.
So I think the next most relevant thing is the hardcover, like we say, came out, sold pretty well. We went to paperback. And there's a couple stories to tell on paperback that are pretty fun because, and you'll have to tell this one, we'll get to Joshua scans eventually. You'll have to tell this one from your perspective. As I remember, you being you called and said, all right, how many copies are the various bookstores taking? And Tor told you like that they got a really good pickup from Barnes & Noble. It was something like 6 or 8 copies per store, which is fantastic for a brand new author. This is the paperbacks. That meant that every Barnes & Noble in the country was either getting 6 or 8, depending if they were a strong science fiction store or not. Stronger ones got 8, I think. Weaker ones got 6. Maybe they got 4. But there was like...
I think 4 was
4 and 8.
For the placement.
And as I recall... you immediately went, when the book came out opening week, to the Barnes & Noble that you knew was a strong science fiction store, and they only had 4. And so you called Tor and you said, you told me the strong stores were getting 8 and the weak stores were getting 4. This one only has 4. It's one of the best science fiction stores in the country. What's going on? And they're like, oh, we wrote the number down wrong or something. They gave you some excuse. And they got 4 more copies. You came back to me just a week or 2 later. And you're like, all right, that one now has all 8 copies. And you then checked it around the country to other places you went, and you made sure that they had all gotten their copies in.
And that was all a lot easier to do when we had a lot more bookstores. I just can't, when Brandon was first published, I could kind of justify to people doing bookstore visits because you could go to like a big mall and they'd maybe have a Walden Books or B. Dalton in the mall, and then one side of the mall there'd be a Barnes & Noble, and the other side of the mall there'd be a Borders, and you could do this like one thing and make a lot of bookstore headway. And now it's pretty much you would go and there's just a Barnes & Noble, and I can't tell people to go and and do that whole like Lee Modesitt thing when you're doing all that mileage to visit a third the number of stores you could have visited in the 2000s.
The Lee Modesitt thing is, this is an author that we knew who would go into a bookstore with a catalog of his books and hand them to them and be like, here's what you should order and here's what you should have. I don't know how effective that was with Barnes & Noble since they're all sold. But he tried to get the managers to whatever they called it, to bring in extra copies and things. And it was effective. On that same trip, I learned about Joshua Scan. This is the trip where you did the Kinko's thing. We call it Joshua Scan because Book Scan is like the Nielsen ratings in books. And we went into a Borders that was near the Kinko's. You took us that direction because you knew where it was. You could walk me past. And you went in and you showed me what a bookstore visit is. And a bookstore visit to Joshua was he went to this section and found all his author's books, and he looked at the price tag on the back because Borders put its own tag on, its own sticky on. And the sticky, if you knew the dates at the top, the numbers at the top, they were the date of an order and the number of copies in the order. And so you could look and see, have they gotten reorders? How many reorders have they gotten? How many copies were in that reorder? And you actually had a little book where you wrote all of that down.
Yeah.
This store got this many copies on this date, this many copies on this date, so that you could see how many were actually selling.
Yeah.
So you could look at the royalty reports and see if the publisher was giving you all of the numbers and where the strong bookstores were and where things were selling and how they were reordering. And then you did all the other fun Joshua stuff where you took everything on the bookstore. You never, and I was very impressed by this, you never took anyone else's book and put it and moved it in any way that would be detrimental to them. But if there was space on the bookshelf, you would turn your author's book's face out. You wouldn't turn anyone else's face in, but you're like, well, look at all this space. And you would make the space and you turn them face in. And you knew where on Borders they kept the extra stock behind inside. Like if you reached over the books, there were extra books behind.
Yeah.
And you'd find all the copies of your author's books and you'd make a nice little display out of them. And then if in the front of the store, again, you'd never move someone else's, but if there was empty space on a prime sales spot for one of your author's books, then suddenly Joshua's author's books are covering all of the empty spaces and all the things. And so you knew how many were being sold, and you did this little shindig to make sure that your author's books had the best chance of selling that they possibly could.
Yep. And now just said can't justify doing that because the volume of bookstores isn't there to go around to that. Borders isn't there. You just don't have as many places to do it. And then, once I got BookScan and could get actual books, which was not too many years after, because it was by 2008, I had actual BookScan.
Yeah.
The need to keep my own little spreadsheets and all of this was there for slowly drifted away, realized its time had come and gone.
But that was the era. I miss that era just because I think part of the reason the publishers are floundering, I talked about this in my classes, they knew how to sell a book when they could get shelf space to sell it. They knew how to make a cover that sold, they knew how to get the blurbs that sold, and how to work with Barnes & Noble to get those books in front of people so that when someone arrived and it was a brand new hardcover by Tor with this, Irene Gallo had a really good eye for artists that hadn't worked in book covers before, but whose art felt interesting and new and would stand out on the shelf. I was one of the first Stefan Martiniere covers for that reason. Irene had just been watching, and then as soon as something got saturated, she would have a new couple illustrators she'd been working with that were often coming from the concept art world for movies that would do covers for her that would stand out and look different on the shelf. They really knew how to do this, and now that people aren't buying books by browsing, they're buying them by watching TikTok videos. The publishers still, decade later, are floundering on how to sell a book.
But that's also a change at Barnes & Noble.
Yeah.
It was really nice when you could write a check for $2,500 to Barnes & Noble and get that mass market tower placement that guaranteed what Brandon was mentioning for Elantris. But it also meant I remember going to London Book Fair and peak, and I just couldn't walk into another bookstore in London because even though you had Waterston's, you had Borders, and you had Books, etc., which was the Borders, like mall stores, the front of the store was the exact same in all of them, and they were just boring.
Yep. You always preferred Borders to Barnes & Noble because Barnes & Noble started that earlier. All the bookstores basically were the same.
So I give James Daunt a lot of credit for kicking that system over and saying, I want to go back to the Borders way, where you get books in the store that people in that store want to buy.
Yeah.
But it has also... So as a book buyer, I go into Barnes & Noble now, and I love the stores way more than 20 years ago. And as an agent, I find it intensely frustrating because, as Brandon has said, the publishers can't just write a check. And it's so much harder to know that a book is going to get into Barnes & Noble and have like a running start.
And even if that Barnes & Noble getting a lot in there will mean anything, because sometimes it really does and sometimes it really doesn't.
And we had two chains. So one thing I could notice after Mistborn came out was the cover was not as enduring as the cover we have for Elantris. And Borders kept hardcovers on the shelf longer. So I could see the quick hook at Barnes & Noble, but also see at Borders that Mistborn, the hardcover, just kept selling steadily over the full year because, cover or not, people knew it was a really good book and they were talking it up from the moment that it came out.
So going back to Elantris, our reviews, I remember our reviews being good except for Kirkus, that did not like it at all. They panned it. And this is the big snooty book reviewer.
Yeah.
They were very hard on Elantris. And a lot of the like hardcore, like the Usenet people were also, they didn't even read it. They're just like, commercial fantasy and things like that. But it sold really well. And I think part of it for me was releasing a standalone. Part of that fatigue over Terry Goodkind. And what happened, it was a 1-2 punch because it was Robert Jordan then Terry Goodkind, where epic fantasy started to sell mainstream numbers in hardcover, which was a big deal, right? Like fantasy had been a paperback genre for so long, and it started to change really in the 80s. But in the 90s, with Robert Jordan and Terry Goodkind, instant bestsellers and doing so well in hardcover, everyone thought what we need is book 1 of 10. And every one of these things that flopped, it's like book 1 of 10. And not realizing that they still had Robert Jordan, Terry Goodkind, and George R. R. Martin in the middle of series, and readers didn't want to start book 1 of 10 because they were still waiting for Robert Jordan book 12 and Game of Thrones book whatever and Terry Goodkind book whatever.
And I'll follow up on that and say you were very strategic early in your career in mixing it up.
Yes.
That one of the big reasons when Brandon was sending me the books pre-Elantris was I could just see the magic systems in them and see that Brandon had this ability to work in a lot of different magic systems, a lot of different worlds that a lot of fantasy writers don't have. And you took advantage of that right from the dawn of your career because Elantris then turns into Mistborn with a completely different magic system. And then you're also then going to do Warbreaker, which is another. So
and Alcatraz was in there with a completely different theme, but also a magic system that was,
Yeah, so very early on, people could see that you were able to work across a lot of different worlds, a lot of different magic systems, and you just took advantage of that competitive thing you had over most other writers and have kept going with that.
It's really useful. It was really useful in the social media era. It still is. But I was the first author who launched into the social media era, the first generation of authors. I wouldn't say I'm the first, I was that generation that launched into, like, I was there as a brand new author when MySpace was dying and Facebook was beginning and when Twitter launched, right? And having a thing, like in the 80s and 90s, you didn't need to be known for any one thing. There wasn't as much noise to cut through. You were the big fantasy release. People read that. early in my career, like I always say that, magic systems are my marketing thing. They're not as important to the books as the characters and the plots. But being known for something, and I leaned hard into it, was really important because there's all of this vying for your attention and knowing, okay, this is the person I'm going to pick up. It's going to be a completely new magic system, but it's going to be rule-based. It's going to approach it from a different direction. It's going to be really interesting, and he's going to use it in a new way. Gave me something to hook readers and make a brand around my name rather than one book series. And that was really important. Some of the authors that broke out at the same time as me, the series took off and the author didn't. And that'd been very common all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And in the new era, I don't think you can do that as easily. I think you need to be building like a rapport with the reader. You need to have them watching for your new releases in a different way than we did back in the old days.
Yeah, it's definitely, in terms of like launching a series, it's gotten a lot harder now because of some of the retail shifts.
Yeah.
The book scan fall off from a book 1 to book 2 is often just way bigger than what I would have seen 20 years ago. And I do want to go back. You mentioned the cover, but I want to just say again, you got a really good cover for Elantris. It still holds up pretty well after 20 years.
Yeah.
And there are not a lot of book covers that you can say that about.
We have changed Mistborn 5 times.
It took, 4 times to get a half good cover.
I like the John Foster hardcovers.
Yes.
They just didn't work in paperback.
Yeah.
I've liked all my Mistborn covers, but they go out of date very quickly.
Yeah, that was a conversation we had.
And the Elantris cover, like Elantris is one that I've just never wanted to change.
Yeah.
I think it's become iconic. And I really love that we got that really gorgeous Stefan Martiniere cover.
Yeah.
It just really evokes the feel perfectly. It's his daughter who is playing Serene as the model.
Okay.
So I've always I got to meet her. At a convention. She was there selling prints of this with herself in it. And so the next kind of big thing that happened for Elantris was the Leatherbound that we're holding here. And you can so Elantris built Brandon Sanderson, but the Elantris Leatherbound built Dragonsteel. You can kind of say that because I remember the first ideas for this coming. It's a mix of 2 things. One is trying and being so annoyed that I couldn't get the Wheel of Time Leatherbounds. That were so hard they only printed 250 copies of them. And I wanted a nice set of wheels. You just cannot collect them all, right? There's more than 250 people in the world who want those books, and they each have a few of them and are not going to sell any of them to the others. There might not be any full sets. I don't know. But also kind of being disappointed with those Leatherbounds because they were just the Tor books. Just the guts were the exact same book. They printed them and put a new cover on them. Same printing. And so part of it was that. Part of it was, and maybe you can tell me, I think it was 2011. Your memory for dates is better than mine. Sometime in the early 2010s, Macmillan shut off the ability to buy Tor books because of contract disputes over ebook pricing as they moved to the agency model. And the publishers eventually got sued by the Department of Justice and lost that judgment. But all of that happened. And so for a month, people couldn't buy my books on Amazon. The Buy It Now button was gone. They could only buy used copies on the marketplace. And our sales tanked, obviously, because even by then, Amazon was the biggest buyer of books, and now it's even worse. And I realized I have to be ready for a world, because what Amazon wanted to do, they wanted to sell books for 99 cents. They wanted all books to be between $2.99 and 99 cents, and they wanted them to just be bargain basement prices in order to sell Kindles and to establish dominance of them for themselves in the ebook market. And then maybe they would raise prices eventually. I don't think their plan ever was to raise prices. I think it was to sell Kindles. and then to not make money on what the Kindles were selling, because they wanted people to buy Kindles and then eventually get them into the buying everything on Amazon. They were going to make their money not on books. They were going to make their money on socks. And books were going to be, and they still kind of are, Amazon's loss leader to the world. And I realized I might have to make a living off of my income being cut by 90%. And that's when I decided we were going to try to make Leatherbounds for the 20th anniversary. I was using the model being my friend Howard Taylor, who would release a webcomic online for free and then would sell the collections. And he lived off the sales of the collections. Ad revenue was meaningless. He just needed to sell those collections. And so the people who loved them would buy the more expensive product to have copies of them and support the artist, even if it was given away for free. And I thought books might be essentially free. And so I went to Tom Doherty and I said, hey, can I have my Leatherbound rights back? This is the CEO of Tor. And he's like, those are worthless, Brandon. We couldn't sell even 250 copies of The Wheel of Time. Because for as excited people were to get them, it cost him to print those books almost more than he sold them for, because you do such a small print run. And Barnes & Noble hated them because they didn't want to keep these expensive books on the shelf. And you just can't sell them. And I'm like, I think I can sell these. So he just gave them back to me for free, all of my Leatherbound rights. And I went to my team and I said, we're going to start selling premium versions of my books in order to hedge against all books going down to 99 cents. And I explained the model. It's the same model that musicians use. Streaming revenue is meaningless to them. They make money off of their touring. And Leatherbounds were going to be our touring. And my team stepped up, and they built this book. And we released it for the 10th anniversary. And the sky didn't fall as much as I feared it would. But this is one of the times I've really presaged the market. I kicked off a big renaissance in premium editions. To the point that now it's what everyone does. All of these crates and loot boxes and things like that. And I feel that this book, I think we sold 10,000 copies. I think we're up to like 50,000 on this. I'd have to ask Kara what our sales are, but I know we sold our initial print run of 10,000 just right out the gate very quickly. And we do 50,000 first printings now on all of our like Stormlight Leatherbounds and things like that. And like this is what gave us the knowledge and the understanding to run like our Kickstarters and stuff. And it's what let me build the infrastructure to build an entire warehouse and fulfillment team so that Amazon could never be in charge of whether or not I sold books ever again. Even if it would hurt, but if they turned off buying Brandon Sanderson books, I still have a career. Mm-hmm. What was your perspective on any of that from behind the scenes?
So I've always kind of big on the idea that people have things they do well and things that they do less well. And I don't think you should ever be afraid to step back from something you do less well in order to have somebody who can do it better do it.
Right.
And you were right. It really is kind of that the big companies simply couldn't do what you were doing here with the way, and really they still kind of can't.
No, I don't think they can.
As you've mentioned, there are more like special editions right now, but also, the special edition is the edition more now than and we still have so many weird. One of the advantages you have at Dragonsteel is because you're doing it and not having to deal with the distribution in the bookstores, you have time. So we don't have the issues at the big publishers. Multiple of my clients, not just you, something happened with the tip sheets, and all of a sudden it's a really big scramble. You may need to delay fulfilling a book to somebody, but you don't actually need to worry about getting a replacement set of tip sheets back to the warehouse in a week, because the book is going. And the other part of that is you can make a pie bigger when there are more opportunities for people to have a piece of it.
I've always said that books, everyone is happier when there are multiple price points on books. I like when there are $2.99 editions. I didn't want all books to always there, but a $2.99 edition, a normal sort of $14, $15, $10 to $15 edition, and a $50 edition and a leatherbound, you get to self-select. In a lot of ways, the expensive editions are subsidizing the cheap editions. It's okay to have 99-cent and $2.99 editions if we also have these that the collectors can buy, because the average income actually goes up for the author. And you get to pick which edition you want to have.
And if we look at the numbers, I'm sure that there are people who say, what did we do when we agreed to let Brandon have these rights? Because look at this, but also the past few years, Brandon's traditional publishing business has just been steadily upward. And it's not in spite of the fact that you're able to do all of this.
And the other thing is, like, the publishers really can't do these leatherbounds, but they were willing to work with us on the Wheel of Time leatherbounds, and it's kind of coming back to them. The fact that Tom gave me these for free, I'm sure there are some people in there that are like, oh, we shouldn't have let go of those, but now they're going to make money off of each of these Wheel of Time leatherbounds, which they never would have if he hadn't given me my rights back. And they wouldn't have done leatherbounds like this. So Tom doing that actually has earned the company, I'm going to guess, millions and millions of dollars off of now 14 leatherbound Wheel of Time books, assuming we get them all done, that we're paying to Tor. So so it all kind of comes around, and this is the book that did it. This is the book that I wrote. I'd been told your first 5 books were terrible. Are generally terrible. I wrote 5 novels that you never saw, that no one really ever saw. A few of my friends saw some of them that were experiments. And then I said, all right, I'm going to sit down, and I now know I want to write epic fantasy for sure. And I wrote Elantris. And that's the one that I wrote kind of, this is what I want my career to be. I didn't know if it would sell, but coincidentally, it's also the one that I sold. I wrote this, White Sand, and Dragonsteel, all kind of as, here are my epic fantasy offerings to the world. And it is like I said, the little book that could. The book that that I came up with about a zombie living in a city full of zombies that I wouldn't call a zombie, and an evil missionary who had to convert the world, otherwise it'd be destroyed. And it turned into Elantris, and 20 years later, it still, like, is the book. I wonder how many copies. I wonder if it still just sold 400 copies last week. That would be pretty funny. I could look it up, but
across formats, it most certainly did,
but
because I know the print sales were over 200 copies last week.
The book that just for 20 years has sold 400 copies a week.
It sells better now than it ever has, and that's no joke.
Nope.
It literally... It does sell better now than it ever has.
So there we are. There's our 20th anniversary retrospective.
So
we'll be back in 10 years for the 30th.
So congratulations.
Thanks, Joshua.
Brandon.
Thank you for what you did on this book.
So,
you really helped make this book what it is. And
thanks.
You should feel very proud of this. I am very glad for our association.
As am I. Thank you.